Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Hugh Jackman has been murdered and it's up to his flock to solve the mystery in the whodunnit, the Sheep Detectives. George Hardy, played by Hugh Jackman, is a shepherd that far prefers the company of his sheep to people, spending his nights reading them murder mystery books, unaware they do actually understand and enjoy them. When they find George murdered, his smartest sheep Lily, voiced by louis-dreyfus, becomes determined to try and find the culprit using what they've learned from George's books, and maybe even point the hapless human police officer Tim, played by Nicholas Braun, in the right direction. The Sheep Detectives is based on the 2005 book 3 Bags Full by German writer Lainey Swan, which became a huge international bestseller. The book even got a sequel in 2010 about the sheep investigating a werewolf. No, really, which finally got an English translation last year under the title Big Bad Wool, presumably to capitalise on this film adaptation. So there is sequel potential if this does well. The film version is written by Craig Mazin, the creator of Chernobyl and The Last of Us, presumably making up for the days when he had credits on the sequels to Scary Movie and The Hangover. Mazin has wanted to make a film of the book for a long time, and he spent a decade pursuing the rights before he finally got them. And it should be noted that the book and the film are very different animals, and the adaptation makes substantial changes to make it more palatable to a family audience, because it does get properly dark, especially with the shepherd George, who is a far less clean-cut character than he is in the film. In the book, he's a drug trafficker using his sheep as mules for marijuana, the other kind of grass, which, needless to say, is not in this movie. It's not a child-friendly book if you're looking to read it as a bedtime story after seeing the film. So the film is a very loose adaptation that takes the basic concept and characters but largely goes in its own direction. That might explain why Mazin has a story credit on the film, which is unusual for something that is already based on existing source material, and the adaptation credit is in the end crawl. But as I keep saying, we are in the midst of a full-blown resurgence of the murder mystery, or as the trailer for this film calls it, a herder mystery. We're seeing them pop up all over the place, but we've recently seen an interesting space of them aimed towards younger viewers. Some of you might recall that I very recently reviewed Flavia, another family whodunit, which was also based on a book. And so these movies are not just playing towards older viewers who are familiar with the usual conventions of these kind of stories, but also introducing them to kids as well. And The Sheep Detectives is both a homage and a loving send-up that calls attention to those very same tropes as part of the plot. There's a lot of talk about rules, the predictable patterns that will help them solve the case, and sure enough, when you think back upon it, you realise that the movie has been dutifully obeying them right in front of you. It has so much meta talk about genre rules that it almost rivals a Scream movie, which are murder mystery send-ups now that I think about it, so it does check out. But pointing at the conventions also allows kids to understand it better, even if, and I pointed this out with Flavia as well, the exposition can be somewhat laboured to make absolutely sure they're following along. But the best way of describing the Sheep Detectives is as simple as it's Knives Out meets Babe. In fact, it's pretty clear the latter was a massive influence for this, given it follows a similar plot structure and beats. And even Jackman drops a "that'll do" that my generation will have to refrain themselves from adding pig onto. And the film is certainly at its best when it focuses on the flock, aided by an absolutely stacked voice cast from top to bottom, even in smaller roles like Patrick Stewart as an elder sheep with Orv, Regina Hall's vain Cloud, or Rhys Darby's Wool Eyes who clumsily can't see what he's doing. There's also Brett Goldstein in a dual role as Rams, Ronnie and Reggie, named after the infamous Cray twins, and just as equally want to bash things up as much as their namesake. The effects of the sheets themselves are top notch. Once again, the creature experts at Framestore, known for the Paddington films, are responsible for much of it, and they strike the right balance of making sure they're relatively photorealistic, but still having enough for them to be expressive and distinct. Kyle Boulder, who directed the Minions films and has a long VFX background, is the director, which makes perfect sense, considering this is a live-action animation hybrid where the latter has to carry the vast majority of the runtime and also integrate itself with the on-set actors. But he's also got a pretty good sense of comic timing too, and you can see that in some of the more elaborate slapstick set pieces, especially when Chris O'Dowd's Mopple runs blindfolded all through a house. You can easily imagine a version of this where it's entirely animated, and it does have that visual sensibility. A lot of the humour comes from the sheep having to navigate themselves in the human world. They live a very simple existence that's almost like a child's eye view of the world, and willfully oblivious when it comes to uncomfortable truths, choosing to collectively forget together rather than confront it. But they're forced to go out of their comfort zone, or rather their hillside, if they want to catch the killer, and find themselves having to try and work through the human world, both in terms of physical things like hedges, doors and windows that can block them, but also understanding more complicated concepts. That includes religion, and there's a bit where naturally the sheep get confused about the concept of a shepherd and God as a spiritual concept, which flummoxes their woolly minds. But if human traditions are inexplicable to the sheep, then so is some of their own, in particular their intolerance to sheep born in the winter, who are shunned by the rest of the flock for being born out of season. There's a cute little winter lamb who's isolated, and their behaviour makes no sense to George, as much as he tries to raise it by hand. Now, I did actually look this up, by the way, and while sheep do often reject their offspring, this winter lamb thing appears to be a bit of a myth of creative licence. Needless to say, this is not a David Attenborough documentary about sheep, and you probably shouldn't be going in with that kind of expectation, although according to one article, someone did. Much more familiar with the world of the humans is Black Ram Sebastian, voiced by Bryan Cranston, renamed from Othello in the book for fairly obvious reasons. Sebastian is himself something of a brooding loner because he was also a winter lamb, but he also has a strong connection with George, who rescued him. Sebastian is jaded and cynical because of what he's gone through, but he does aid Lily as much as he doubts her, warning them of the dangers of humans. Cranston gives an excellent voice performance here, selling the cranky laugh lines as much as his character's pathos. The humour is often quite gentle, and while never laugh out loud funny, it is pretty amusing, but underpinning the lighter stuff is a darkness. Not as dark as the book, obviously, but this is still a movie dealing with a fatality, and there is a side to it that is surprisingly existential. It's a film that does actually allude to the big questions, often asked by the chatterbox lamb Zora, voiced by Bella Ramsey, who is almost endlessly inquisitive. You see, the sheep believe that when they die, they'll turn peacefully into clouds, but when they find George's body, it's also the first time they had to confront the idea of death directly. And being detectives, they keep making discoveries that are not always pleasant. But they have to find justice for George, not just as a way of saving themselves, but also closure rather than just simply forgetting him. It's a movie that is about death and grief, and it explores that in a way that is accessible for young viewers, but poignant enough to be quite affecting for adults. It's very unexpectedly bittersweet, and I did find myself genuinely moved by it at points in a way that took me completely by surprise. I wouldn't have believed before seeing it that the sheep detectives would give me a bit of a lump in my throat, but that's exactly what happened. And Julie Louis-Dreyfus is perfectly cast for the lead role of Lily, who can handle the more comic and dramatic sides of it, but also well suited for what I was going to describe as a fluffy Miss Marple, until I discovered that the name of the character in the book was in fact Miss Maple. Lily might be the smartest sheep, but she's not the most worldly, and she has to understand that she doesn't know everything. I do think that a lot of the cast were specifically chosen for their ability to handle both the laughs and emotions of the script, as Chris O'Dowd's Mopple is a blundering character, but he also has one of the film's bigger dramatic reveals as well. It is commendable that the movie accomplishes this very delicate balance in tone, but that's exactly the point. Life, in all its complexities, is about dealing with difficult things like loss and change that makes the moments of joy and happiness even more significant. That is a lot more depth than I would have expected for a film like this. When it comes to the human characters, The Sheep Detectives is far less sure-hooved, something which it has inherited somewhat from its source material, although the fact that it's helmed by a director who is more known for animation might have something to do with it too. Hugh Jackman may have top billing, but obviously he doesn't stick around for very long because he's the victim, and he largely exits the film around the 15-minute mark. George is a lot cleaner cut than his book counterpart, so Jackman gives warmth and theatricality to his early scenes where he tends and reads to his flock, but also a touch of that Wolverine bitterness in his interactions with almost everyone else. Jackman pops up periodically through the rest of it, either in flashbacks or in dream sequences with Lily, but he's such a big presence that it does lend the film a needed sense of absence when he departs. Mostly it's this big ensemble piece, all set in the small fictional English town of Denbrook, although it does have a bit of a transatlantic vibe to it because of the casting and the American filmmakers. This is also a change from the book, where the fictional Glenkill was in Ireland. It's also very much a chocolate box view of England that's very eye-poppingly colourful, and clearly a lot of the businesses here are using the services of the neon sign makers in town. That even comes down to the knitwear that most of the characters wear, which you'd almost expect given this is a film about sheep, and is very much Knives Out approved. Tosin Cole's rival shepherd Caleb, who has his eyes on George's sheep now that he's died, has some especially strong jumper game I've noticed. But this being a whodunit, nearly everyone in town is a suspect with a reason to potentially bump George off because they've all got their own grudges, including Conleth Hill's Ham, a butchery despised, to Covenor Holdbrook-Smith as the town's reverend, who George made a very large donation to on the day before his death. There's also Hong Chow's innkeeper Beth, who's nursing a massive jealous crush on George, but the very talented Chow is extremely underutilised here, as well as wrestling with a very wobbly attempt at an English accent, although she's not the only one in fairness. And that's before Emma Thompson pops up as George's lawyer Lydia to reveal that he had a wealthy inheritance, and she gets quite a few chuckles out of a haughtily particular snob that has little patience for fools, even if it is largely an exposition role that doesn't give her an awful lot to do. Also new in town is Molly Gordon as George's estranged daughter Rebecca, who is increasingly falling under suspicion given the time of her arrival and that she stands to inherit most from his death and his will. Unfortunately, the case is in the hands of gormless local policeman Tim, who has absolutely no clue and certainly can't see them right in front of him. I quite like Nicholas Braun's portrayal of an absolute dipstick, even if again he's got a bit of a questionable accent, but he does make the character endearingly good-natured as he tries to prove himself. Luckily he's got a bit of help from visiting reporter Elliot, played by Nicholas Galitzine, who apparently Amazon MGM are putting a lot of stock in this year, as he's seen to be seen as He-Man in the Master of the Universe movie next month. Galitzine's definitely Clark Kenting it here with his glasses and loose clothing hiding his rippling muscles, but his Elliot at least knows how to photograph a crime scene or an awareness there is even a crime scene at all to give Tim some handy little tips on how to do his job properly. The rest of those come from the sheep, who have to increasingly try to direct his limited deduction, although I did find it quite amusing that he's stupid enough to take commands from farm animals, but smart enough to realise that they are genuinely trying to help him. Although, of all the human characters, Tim might be the one who steals the show, as much as the show can be stolen from those sheep anyway. When I first saw the trailer for this film, I thought it was an absolutely bizarre premise, and I just thought it was going to be a silly, broad comedy. But like the flock in the movie, I underestimated the sheep detectives. Now it does have its issues, it actually has quite a slow start at first, and the tone does initially make you think it's only going to be aimed at kids, but over time, it does develop a certain charm, revealing itself as not just a very sweet and cute film, but also one with a surprising amount of depth as well. Yes, it isn't laugh out loud funny, but perhaps it shouldn't be, but it is enough to balance out the fact that it is ultimately about the inevitability of grief in a way which is accessible and emotionally affecting. It's a good example of a family movie done right, it'll appeal to both kids and adults, and I think they'll see the movie differently too, as those themes become more resonant with age. It's a movie that I think will age quite well, and will be a bit of a sheeper hit. Okay, I'll stop now. I'd honestly say this has to be one of the year's most pleasant surprises, and proof that just because something's fluffy doesn't mean it's insubstantial. But about that werewolf themed sequel, can we greenlight that immediately? If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip on my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Sue Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can tend to my flock over on my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and hype the video. It really is a great help. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.